Hey everyone, this is Heretics Corner. Thank you for joining us. Unfortunately, Dean and Nulli aren't here with us tonight. I'm Obaid, and tonight we're really excited to have on Sarah Haider. Sarah is one of the co-founders of Ex-Muslims of North America, and I think you're also the director of public outreach, if I'm not mistaken.
No, I'm the executive director.
Okay, sorry. And so like I said, really happy to have you on. Thanks for coming on. So if you wanted to just start a little bit, go into your background, and then we can go from there.
Yeah, sure. So I grew up in a relatively liberal Shia Muslim household, and I was raised in Texas, so I kind of got an introduction to what American Islam is like, particularly where I grew up. There was a large Muslim community, so I was pretty familiar with, the Muslim community and pretty well acquainted with the way that Muslim communities work in the United States. And I left Islam when I was 15 or 16. I can't quite recall, so I always say somewhere between there because I really don't know exactly when. But I left Islam around then. I just became an atheist. I just stopped believing in God first, and then I thought, okay, I guess this means I'm not Muslim anymore. And ever since then, I had been living my life pretty openly as an atheist. My family requested that, I don't tell too many people about what I believe outside of the family home. So I kept it to myself within the community, but outside of it, I was free to be whoever I wanted to be. But since then, I've been working with Ex-Muslims of North America. It's been 5 years now, almost, which is crazy. Longer, yeah, actually, a little bit longer than 5 years, which is amazing. So yeah, that's my background, I guess.
Basically, we're normally talking about what apostates go through, but I wanted to speak to you about because you were just speaking at an ex-Amish conference, if I'm not mistaken.
Something like that, yeah. It's from an organization called Amish Heritage Foundation. They're a new group, and they exist. I mean, I don't want to restate their mission statement. Everyone can look them up and to find out more about them. But the idea is just to help people leave the Amish lifestyle. And so they had their inaugural conference this year, and they invited me to be a part of it and to talk about the ways in which we are similar, our groups, and what we can learn from each other. So it turned out to be this really interesting thing, really unique experience, that's for sure.
No, that's actually what I was kind of, because we try to focus on what different, I don't want to call them extremist faiths, but faiths that can get very extreme, what they have in common with apostates. So what did you find with between the Amish and Islam? Everyone knows about the shunning because there's all kinds of jokes about the shunning with the Amish, but aside from that, what else did you find?
Well, there's a lot. There's a lot of similarities. Like you said, with many fundamentalist faith, they tend to follow a pretty, there's a kind of a blueprint that most extremist, conservative, fundamentalist groups tend to follow. But there are ways in which Islam is different, in particular, in that from the difference, I think that's most clear to me from Amish and Muslim background is that violence tends to play a different role there. In fact, they're not as likely to physically harm or kill somebody who leaves the faith or the lifestyle. But we are, of course. But there's so many similarities, it's hard to count. But it's just interesting to talk to all the different people. There are different kinds of Amish people. I didn't know a lot of the background of the different kinds of Amish groups and the levels of conservatism among them. So I got to be educated quite a bit when I was there. So that was very interesting. But the Amish are in many ways, from a social conservatism perspective, more extreme than the average Muslim, from my experience. Even I would say the most Salafi Muslim families are not as socially restrictive as Amish groups are. Amish groups they don't go to school after the 8th grade. Many of them don't have high school education. I don't think anybody has a college education. And when they are educated, they're educated in these one room schoolhouses, often by an Amish teacher, who herself or himself has just an 8th grade education. So from that perspective, they're definitely very different from Muslims, and there's restrictions with a lot of basic things that we take for granted, different kinds of labor-saving devices that they're not allowed to use. And I think it depends on which Amish, which group, local group you're a part of, and that sort of, I think, makes a difference as to what labor-saving devices and to what extent one can use them. But, people were talking about things like, after leaving the lifestyle, having a hot shower for the first time. And I thought that was incredible, that there are people who just never had such basic, simple, pleasurable experiences because of, certain lifestyle, certain ideology. So that was very interesting. But one of the things that I found was particularly intriguing was the extent to which they felt that they were romanticized and not addressed in the way that they thought they should be addressed by academia. And I thought that those experiences definitely Muslims or people from Muslim backgrounds have as well, kind of a misunderstanding in the broader culture, and certainly kind of a romanticization of the faith from the outside.
Yeah, okay, touching on that, do you find, and I'm not talking about, you're being used by the left or the right or whatever, but don't you find that even for, ex-Muslims, there is kind of a fetishization, so it's overall it's people on either side, having a fetish over Islam, but then, some percentage are going towards ex-Muslims, some percentage are going towards Muslims. Do you feel that as well, or do you or am I not making myself clear?
Yeah, can you explain that a little bit?
Okay.
I think I know what you're.
I'm not saying okay, it's someone saying okay, they're bringing you out just as a token, but it's they continuously speak about Islam for the most part. They'll talk about other religions as well, but it's mainly Islam. And then, so either they're, okay, no, you have to believe only ex-Muslims and this is it, and there's no other people to believe, or then it's the complete opposite. It's no, only people who are Muslim. So it's kind of it's a sub-fetish of a fetish of Islam is ex-Muslims. It's...
Well, I think the tokenization, to the extent that exists, and I think it exists in the left as well as the right, but in many different ways in the left. I think that's applied to all minority groups, and Islam in this sense is kind of treated as a racial minority group, which I think is very interesting and disturbing. So definitely, yeah. I feel that the tokenization thing is absolutely real, particularly on the left. And as I participate in the broader secular community, it's hard not to feel as if you are, this supposed to be this representation for an entire group of people, rather than just one voice that comes from a specific background.
Yeah, with that too, that's... Do you think that's just because there is such a lack of voices? And that's one good thing, I have to say, I just want to say this off the start, I'm extremely, extremely proud to be a member of the group, and, the things you guys have been doing, the videos you did, and then the normalizing dissent, so, people who normally wouldn't speak are getting out there, so,
Yeah, some of it is. I think it's easier to tokenize people when there just aren't that many voices, because what can you do but take what a person from that group is saying as somewhat representative of the broader group, unless you know more about that group and there are more people that are speaking up to show the diversity within that group. So I think there is a problem of representation in minority groups in general. And I've spoken of this a little bit in the past, in that when it comes to conservative groups or groups that like religious groups, which have a motivation to present a very unblemished face to the outside world. Any group that is conservative in that way will uplift the kinds of leaders and spokespeople who kind of whitewash away all the problems within those communities. So that's where we see, these so-called liberal or progressive voices coming from the Muslim community who do everything but talk about the problems within the Muslim community. And I think it's hard not to develop that kind of dynamic when there's so few people that exist to speak up from a certain kind of community, and the community has a very strong interest to push forth a specific kind of narrative.
Do you think it's also, let's just put it this way, like, if they're going to have a story about a Muslim woman, it's almost invariably going to be in a hijab, and it's not that, like, just because it's a woman in a hijab, that's not a big thing, but they hardly ever show any other kind of variety in the media themselves. So it's, I mean... Well,
I mean, part of it is that it's just, for the hijab is a little bit, it's complicated, because on the one hand, it is a very visually representative, garment, and it is symbolic in a way that no other garment is, because no other garment is that particular to Islam in that way. So on the one hand...
If I can just interrupt for a second, I wasn't specifically talking about the hijab. I was talking about how in the media, like, if they're going to put on someone who's Muslim, like, you're like they're foisting upon their viewership, okay, like, this is what a Muslim is. Like, you rarely see, a woman without a hijab. It's mainly, if you have a woman on, it's with a hijab. Usually, they don't have a lot of mullahs or anything on, but it's almost like they give you a certain look, and this is what a Muslim is, right? So it's not just
right, but that's what I mean, in the sense that there are many reasons why that occurs. And I think one is simply that from a perspective of a producer, of a news producer, let's say I start a show, and I want to be stimulating for people. You might pick people who are very visually representative of a certain kind of group. And I mean, I'm not trying to justify the practice. I'm just saying that that there is a drama aspect of it that I think particularly the media takes into consideration, which in our case ends up benefiting the conservative, extremely religious, literal-minded people who think that this really should be the visual representation of what a Muslim looks like, that this really should be the symbol for the rest of us, and particularly for women everywhere. I don't know to what extent the media personalities or shows or hosts who invite these people to speak on as representatives of the Muslims. I don't know to what extent they're really thinking about it very deeply. I think it's a very, and that's what's so depressing about this whole thing, that it's sort of, they take shortcuts and are quite lazy in the way that they approach other faiths. And I think that's what leads to this kind of very backwards approach to Islam, because it's something that makes sense if you only think about it for half a second, and if you consider Muslims as a very outside group, and you don't really think about them in the same way you would think about your own, like people in your own family and communities.
Okay, actually, touching on that, when you said outside group, okay, I heard you on another podcast recently. I think it was, I can't remember the name of the podcast, but it was with Helen Pluckrose and Iona Italia.
Mm-hmm.
And you were talking about being an immigrant. And what you'd said, it like struck a chord with me, because I'd said something similar to my friends, and I don't think I kind of explained it properly. But you were talking about how, you're not really part of either world. You're in both of them, but you're not really part of them. So when you're in, like in your case, Texas, in my case, I was in Montreal, like I wasn't, I didn't really experience racism or anything, but there was always a sense of you're not from here, you're an outsider. And then, you talked about going back to Pakistan, and same thing with me when I go back to India, I wasn't quite fitting in there as well. So it was like a sense of, especially for me in Canada, it was a sense of, okay, I've come here, and then, back in the 70s when I was going through grammar school and starting up middle school and all that, they had, civics classes and stuff. So I was taught, like, you have freedom of expression, you have all these things. And, I would joke around at home, like when my parents would tell me to do chores, I'm like, well, I joke around about child labor laws. Because, we learned all this stuff. So I took that to heart, but it was kind of like as an outsider. So it wasn't, it wasn't like, okay, someone who was born and raised in Canada or the United States, and, they were born into that. Like, but for me, it was okay, going back to India and seeing what it was like there, and coming into Canada and seeing how much better it was. I took like those things to heart, but I took it to heart as someone who was not, or maybe I just didn't take them for granted or something. It was just like and especially nowadays, it seems like immigrants and like people like us who were not born in either country, but we basically grew up here.
Mm-hmm.
We hold on to the values that we were told what that country was about more than people who live here. And I because you talked about that, so I just want to know if you wanted to talk about that a little bit more. Or...
Sure. Yeah. I mean, I agree with you with what you're saying, that it's likely due to taking things for granted, and I think some of it is just ignorance. It's what you know because you've experienced two different ways of living, and they haven't, and you have that benefit of experience and knowledge of a different culture, in a way that you didn't just read it in a textbook. You were there, you were living that lifestyle. You can see other people who live this way, and you can see how it affects them. It's one thing to say, well, one country has this philosophy of individualism and they accept individualism, and another country does not, and they're more collectivist in their approach to society. Well, it's one thing to just read that. It's one thing to just think about that in a very abstract academic way. It's quite another to see the ways in which that actually plays out in your day-to-day, very real life, and your relationships with others, and how it affects your behavior in that society entirely. And that's something that is hard to imagine, because I think that's it's just a human thing to kind of fail to imagine the implications of certain things, and I think this is why we, not to go on too much of a tangent, but why writers and authors who come up with these fantastic worlds, dystopias or utopias or whatever it is, and when they come up with a world and then walk through the ways in which that world, the ways in which it's different and how it plays out to create a very different universe and very different social dynamics. I mean, the people who are good at doing that are good for a reason, because that's not something most people can do. Most people can't really put themselves in that in that position, put themselves in that world, and really understand what it means to live under different kinds of like ideological, I guess, I don't know what to call it, because it's not quite something that's accepted by everyone necessarily, but it's value systems, I suppose. And most people can't imagine that. Most people have to actually physically be there to be able to know what that means. And then I think this is where people who have experiences with different cultures can come in and educate, and hopefully this is something that is understood by others, but it won't be understood by everyone. And my fear is that it will take them to personally experience it to get to a point where they're going to understand what it really means to live without certain values that they take for granted at this point. And when I say that, I'm thinking of specifically things like free speech, due process. I think those are two values that I know that we are taking for granted here. And I worry that it will take for a total loss or a near loss of those values for people to really understand what it means to live in a world without them.
Yeah, when you mention free speech and due process, like that's, and unfortunately it's it's not just you can say, okay, well, these people are doing it and those people aren't. I mean, it's everyone. There's very, very few people that are trying to defend like those most basic of civil liberties, and everyone else is just, as far as I can tell, going off the deep end. Actually, that's the last kind of thing, because I am like aware of your time, so I don't want to I don't want to waste too much of it. I'm aware of like one thing. Last thing I wanted to go over. Then, if whatever you want to talk about after that, are you afraid of like an overcorrection? And what I mean is, okay, the new premier in Quebec, he passed this new law, which nobody in any government office can wear an overt symbol of their religion. Yet at the same time, he doesn't want to take out the crucifix from the provincial legislature because he says that's part of our history. And so it's like, and I mean, I'll take it to an extreme case, and it's something that I'm completely opposed to. The people who are burning the Qurans in Iran, like if they want, that's how they want to protest. That's every right to protest how you want. I just think that's the complete wrong way to protest the Quran, and like, so I see that as an overcorrection. Like, are you afraid of things like that? Like, are you afraid of okay, Iran, they kick out the Islamic regime, and then all of a sudden they close all the mosques and they stop people from praying, which is not technically a secular state. It's not a free country. It's just an anti-Islamic state.
Mm. Well, I mean, I think from the perspective of burning the Quran, I disagree with you in that it's an overcorrection. I think it's in the perspective from the specific case of Iran. There's symbolic power to that. It isn't an overcorrection because the oppression is that bad and the dominance of religion is that extreme that kind of a statement is very powerful in that context. But I do see your broader point of overcorrection in general, and I don't think it's even fair to call it an overcorrection. I mean, technically that is what it will be, but what it'll be motivated by. But where we'll end up is somewhere truly frightening, and I think that you can see the way that that's playing out in parts of Europe, and I think it will get worse in Europe. That's what I predict. And because it's become so, it's even something that I don't even like to talk about publicly as much anymore, what's going on in Europe, because right-wing groups in the United States love to use what's going on in Europe to fearmonger in a way that I think is unfair and just incites bad blood among everybody involved and is completely unhelpful. So I've gotten to a point where I'm careful to to even talk about that problem, and that's another problem that we're getting to, which is another form of overcorrection, I think, to not even talk about what could be used as right-wing fodder. But I do think, to go back to what you were saying, I do think definitely that we're going to start seeing that across the board. And it's going to have a lot of support behind it, because people are seeing their world, what they knew to be things that are very important to their culture. They're seeing those things devalued. They're seeing what they might feel to be an unraveling of their culture and of their society, and a debasement of their most treasured values. So I think in a response to it, people will get to this point where they say, I'm fed up, and it's so attractive then to just shut your mind and, tack on with, to start supporting more extremist groups. And I think people find a lot of relief in those extremist groups once they get to that point. So that's a very scary place to be. And sometimes it is the case that the overcorrection is worse than the problem to begin with. And I wouldn't be surprised if that is where we're headed in the future. I hope not. But it wouldn't surprise me to see a resurgence and we are seeing that in Europe, but also just internationally and in a way that will last. Far right, very nationalistic, very explicitly racist organizations and sentiments across the board. I think we're going to see that, and I do fear for what that will mean for Western civilization.
Yeah, well, that's a cheery note. No, I mean, like I said, I'm worried about that, and I mean, I'd love to sit here and debate with you about why I think what they're doing, and I understand what you're saying about the history of the Quran and the oppression and all that in Iran, but I unfortunately don't think we'd have the time if we got into that. But yeah, I'll send you a video I did and of why I think it's wrong, and you can watch it whenever you have time. I just wanted to know, like, if you had, I know you guys have finished up that normalizing dissent tour, but then you've got, Killian Koth is running 100 miles to raise money, and I mean, it's awesome, but I think he's nuts.
Well, that's amazing. It's really an amazing feat for someone to run 100 miles anywhere, but that's what he's doing, and he's doing it for ex-Muslims in North America. So if anyone listening can support him on his run, all the funds are going to go to ex-Muslims in North America, and he has not yet reached his goal. So if I don't know when this is going to come out, but if it does come out and people want to support him, that would be amazing. And I think a great encouragement to him for his run, as well as to, of course, us here at ex-Muslims in North America.
Yeah, no, I mean, I can. We can probably get this out. I think he's running next week, right?
I think so. Yeah.
So I think it's the end of next week, so I could maybe get this out a couple of days before. I mean, is there anything else that XMNA's got planned? Like, are you doing any more like the normalizing dissent, or do you have anything else coming out, or?
I think for now we're going to slow down our campus tour, but we do plan on doing more events in the future. And if anyone's listening who hasn't already signed up for our mailing list, please do so at xmuslims.org. And you can just sign up for our mailing list, and then you'll get to hear everything that we're doing. We send a monthly newsletter that we think is very interesting, and people should sign up if they want to hear about the things that we want them to hear about. And some of that is just news about what's going on in the Muslim world. Other things will include information about the organization and how people can help. And so if that's the first step to learning more about what we are up to at ex-Muslims in North America would be to go on our website, xmuslims.org, and to sign up for that mailing list.
Okay, well, I'll put like all those links down there. I mean, just one last thing, if you don't mind.
Sure.
Okay, and I've heard you speak on this before, but I just wanted to take it from a different tack. Like, I'm not a huge, like, okay, I support people like Majid or anyone else who wants to try to reform Islam. You know, if you can make it, you know, where it's people pick and choose what they want, and it's a very benign thing, it's a very personal thing. I don't really have a problem with that, but it's not like, it's not my end goal. But do you think it's more trying to reform how people think as opposed to trying to reform the text of the religion? So, like, if you were able to get in somehow or other free expression and, you know, freedom of religion in Saudi Arabia, let's just say, like, I'm not expecting to happen tomorrow, but if it happened, and then people were allowed to have an open and free exchange of ideas, do you think, like, that's more of a reform that's needed, like, to change the way people think? Not necessarily, I mean, it's hard to do it without changing the text, but you see what I'm saying? Like, you can change the way you think about the religion as opposed to changing the text of the book.
Well, I think from what I understand of what Majid is doing, he's not changing the text. He is changing the way people think about it, in the sense that he's wanting people to look at it in a different way, less literally. So he is changing the way he wants people to think. Does that make sense?
No, but I mean, like, okay, he's changed the way, okay, the verse about wine doesn't say don't drink. It actually says don't get a buzz so you can have one drink if you want. You know, like things like that. He's playing with like that. But I'm talking about more about where people are allowed to have the option to say, okay, well, you don't need to believe, right? So, like, if you can get them to think that someone who doesn't believe or someone who doesn't question, it's not a bad thing. If you can get them to believe that that's acceptable, then I think it would be a lot easier to get people to.
That's not reforming the faith, though. That's that's doubting.
That's doubting, but that's what I'm saying. But it's reforming the mindset, right? Like, I'm saying, like, the average believer, if they believe that it's okay, that they might believe that that person's still going to go to hell, but they say, okay, well, if you are doubting, or if you're questioning, or even if you've left, that is your decision. I know that's contra to, like, a lot, you know, like a lot of the scripture, but if you can get them to at least do that.
You're not going to get them to do that so long as it's contrary to the scripture, unless they doubt the reality of their own faith. Unless they doubt the truth. Why would I ever believe that if I think the Quran is 100% the word of God? I would never. Why would I ever be liberal in my interpretation if I know for a fact that God wanted this to be God? This is God's final word. He wanted this word to be understood. He didn't want to play a guessing game, so of course it's the most obvious explanation for what he's saying is what it actually is. Why would I open up why would I open up the discourse to more doubting interpretations or less plausible interpretations, or even some of them which are absurd interpretations, right? It's one thing to be, okay, this is likely true, this might be true as well, versus complete hogwash that is definitely not true. Not everything is created equal in that sense, and there are some things where God is very clear. He's very clear with the idea that Islam is a perfect faith. He's very clear that it's the final faith. He's very clear that Muhammad is the messenger of God, and he is a perfect example of a human being. And those things are very clear. And if you get to the point where you're doubting that, you have to already doubt the truth of the faith altogether, because those are the central tenets. So I think that's not. I think what you're describing there, this change of mindset, is really something that can only happen after you already doubt the truth of it to begin with, because you're not going to be somebody who believes in the 100% literal truth of Islam and still be open to something that is clearly blasphemous, that is clearly not allowed according to God's will.
Okay, I understand, and I mean, like, I guess the first thing would have to be, like, get people to stop thinking that it's the actual word of God as opposed to inspired divinely. But again, like I said, I know you have a time limit, so I don't want to go over that. But thank you very much. And if you want to give people your social media or anything like that, or if there's anything else you want to talk about or put out, let me know or send me the links and I'll put them down there.
Sure. Yeah, I'll do that. But mostly it's just xmuslims.org is our website, so please go there if you want to know more about XMNA. Sign up for the mailing list to hear more about what we do.
All right. Well, once again, thanks a lot, Sarah. It was great. And thank you, everyone, for listening. And we'll speak to you next time, or we'll see you next time. Thanks.
All right. Thanks, Obaid.
Thanks.
Bye.